Margaret Williams had always dreamed of wide-open spaces. Growing up in the cramped streets of Manchester, England, she spent her childhood gazing at pictures of American ranches in old magazines. The sprawling fields, the endless sky, and the promise of freedom called to her like nothing else ever had. At 62, Margaret finally made that dream come true. After selling her small flat in England and using her late husband's life insurance money, she purchased a beautiful 50-acre ranch in rural Texas. The property had been on the market for months, and Margaret got it for a steal. The land came with a modest farmhouse, a large red barn, and rolling hills that seemed to stretch forever. The moment Margaret stepped onto her new property, she felt something she had never experienced before: complete peace. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of birds chirping and cattle lowing in the distance. She could hardly believe this paradise was actually hers. Margaret wasted no time settling into ranch life. She bought a dozen horses, some cattle, and even a few goats. The animals brought life to the property in ways she had never imagined. Watching the horses run freely across the fields made her heart soar. She spent her days mending fences, feeding animals, and learning everything she could about ranch management. The neighbors in the area were mostly friendly ranchers who had lived there for generations. They welcomed Margaret warmly, appreciating her genuine love for the land and animals. Old Joe Martinez, who owned the neighboring ranch, became her closest friend and mentor. He taught her how to properly care for livestock and shared stories of the area's history over cups of strong coffee on her front porch. However, about 6 months after Margaret moved in, things began to change dramatically in the area. A large development company purchased several hundred acres of land adjacent to the rural community. They announced plans to build a luxury housing development called Prairie Vista Estates. The developers promised beautiful homes, manicured lawns, and all the amenities of suburban living while maintaining the rustic charm of ranch country. Construction began almost immediately. Margaret watched with growing concern as bulldozers cleared the natural landscape, replacing it with neat rows of identical houses. The sounds of hammering and heavy machinery replaced the peaceful quiet she had grown to love. Dust clouds from the construction site drifted across her property daily, coating everything in a fine layer of grime. Within a year, Prairie Vista Estates was complete. The new subdivision boasted over 200 homes, each with perfectly maintained lawns and decorative fencing. The residents were mostly young professionals from the city who wanted the prestige of living in a ranch community without actually wanting to live near working ranches. The trouble started almost immediately. The new homeowners formed a homeowners association, electing a man named Derek Thompson as their president. Derek was a corporate lawyer who had moved from Dallas, bringing with him very specific ideas about how a neighborhood should look and function. He had purchased his home specifically because the marketing materials promised a refined rural experience. Derek quickly discovered that living next to an actual working ranch was quite different from the sanitized version he had imagined. Margaret's horses made noise in the early morning hours. Her rooster crowed at dawn. The smell of manure drifted across the property line when the wind was right. Occasionally, one of her animals would wander near the fence line that separated her property from the subdivision. The complaint started small. Derek would call Margaret directly, asking if she could keep her animals quieter in the mornings. He suggested she might want to trim the trees along their shared border to make the area look more presentable. Margaret politely explained that this was a working ranch and that some noise and smells were simply part of ranch life. When his direct approach failed to produce the changes he wanted, Derek decided to take a different strategy. He researched local ordinances and zoning laws, looking for any regulation Margaret might be violating. He spent hours at the county courthouse, poring over property records and municipal codes. Derek also began rallying other homeowners to his cause. He organized meetings in the community center, presenting PowerPoint presentations about property values and quality of life issues. He showed pictures of Margaret's ranch, pointing out what he called eyesores and nuisances. Many of the new residents who had paid premium prices for their homes began to worry that having a working ranch next door would hurt their investment. The HOA meetings grew more heated with each passing month. Derek presented increasingly elaborate plans for approaching Margaret about changing her ranch operations. Some residents suggested offering to buy her land. Others proposed filing formal complaints with the county. A few even suggested legal action. Margaret remained unaware of these escalating discussions. She continued her daily routine of caring for her animals and maintaining her property. She noticed that fewer neighbors stopped by to chat, and some seemed less friendly when she encountered them in town. But she attributed this to the natural adjustment period that comes with any major change in a community. The situation reached a boiling point when Margaret decided to expand her operation slightly. She had been so successful with her horses and cattle that she wanted to add a small chicken coop and maybe a few more goats. She applied for all the proper permits and followed every regulation to the letter. Derek saw this expansion as the perfect opportunity to take action. He convinced the HOA board that Margaret was operating an illegal commercial farm in a residential area. He argued that her activities were violating noise ordinances, zoning restrictions, and possibly even health codes. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock everyone involved. Margaret had no idea that her peaceful ranch life was about to be turned upside down by neighbors who believed they had every right to control what happened on her land. Derek was confident that the law was on his side and that a few phone calls to the right authorities would solve his ranch problem, once and for all. Neither side fully understood the legal complexities of their situation. Neither side realized that their dispute would soon escalate far beyond anything they could have imagined. And absolutely no one suspected that the truth about property lines and legal boundaries would turn this entire conflict completely upside down. The morning of March 15th started like any other for Margaret Williams. She woke before sunrise, pulled on her worn boots, and headed out to feed her animals. The horses nickered softly as she approached with their morning hay, and her favorite, Mare Duchess, nuzzled her shoulder affectionately. Margaret had just finished filling the water troughs when she noticed a commotion near the fence line between her property and Prairie Vista Estates. 3 men in business suits were walking along the border, one of them pointing repeatedly at her barn and making animated gestures. She recognized Derek Thompson immediately. His aggressive posture and perfectly styled hair were unmistakable, even from a distance. Curious but not particularly concerned, Margaret continued with her morning routine. She had dealt with Derek's complaints before and assumed this was just another one of his inspection tours. She had learned to document everything carefully, so she pulled out her phone and took a few photos of the men examining her fence line. About an hour later, Margaret heard vehicles approaching her front gate. Looking out her kitchen window, she saw 2 county sheriff's deputies walking up her driveway, followed closely by Derek Thompson and another man she didn't recognize. Her heart rate quickened, but she reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong. Sheriff Deputy Maria Rodriguez knocked firmly on Margaret's front door. She was a veteran officer who had been with the county for over 15 years, and her expression was all business. When Margaret opened the door, Deputy Rodriguez introduced herself and her partner, Deputy James Chen. "Ma'am, we've received a complaint about illegal farming activities on this property," Deputy Rodriguez explained, consulting her notepad. "We need to inspect your operation to ensure you're in compliance with county ordinances." Margaret invited the officers inside for coffee, but they declined, explaining that they needed to conduct their inspection immediately. Derek Thompson stepped forward, practically vibrating with excitement. "Officers, as I explained on the phone, this woman is running a commercial farming operation in violation of residential zoning laws," Derek announced confidently. "She's disturbing the peace, creating health hazards, and operating without proper permits." Margaret felt her face flush with anger, but she kept her voice calm and steady. "I have all my permits in order, and this property is properly zoned for agricultural use," she replied. "I'd be happy to show you my documentation." The second man, who introduced himself as Brad Morrison from the County Code Enforcement Office, stepped forward with a clipboard. "We'll need to see all permits, zoning documentation, and any business licenses," he said officiously. Margaret retrieved a thick folder from her kitchen table. Inside were all her permits for livestock, her agricultural exemption certificate, her property deed, and various other legal documents. She had been meticulous about following every rule and regulation since moving to Texas. Deputy Rodriguez examined the documents carefully while Deputy Chen walked around the property taking notes. Derek followed them closely, pointing out what he considered violations and making increasingly dramatic claims about noise levels and property damage. "You see how close that chicken coop is to our property line?" Derek demanded. "And those horses make noise all hours of the day and night. My wife can't even open our windows because of the smell." Brad Morrison was examining Margaret's zoning certificate with a puzzled expression. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call to the county zoning office. After a brief conversation, he hung up and frowned at his paperwork. "Ma'am, according to our records, your property is indeed zoned for agricultural use," Morrison admitted reluctantly. "Your permits appear to be in order as well." Derek's face turned red with frustration. "That can't be right," he protested. "This is a residential area. How can she operate a farm right next to our subdivision?" Deputy Rodriguez was studying Margaret's property deed more carefully now. She walked over to the fence line and used a measuring app on her phone to check distances from the barn to the property border. Her partner joined her, and they had a quiet conversation that Margaret couldn't hear. "Mr. Thompson," Deputy Rodriguez called out, "can you show me exactly where you believe your property line is located?" Derek marched over confidently and pointed to the fence that separated Margaret's ranch from Prairie Vista Estates. "Right here, obviously," he declared. "This fence marks the boundary between her property and our subdivision." Deputy Chen pulled out a GPS device and began taking readings along the fence line. He compared the coordinates to the legal property descriptions in both Margaret's deed and the subdivision plat maps. After several minutes of careful measurement, he looked up with a surprised expression. "Ma'am," he said to Margaret, "do you have a recent survey of your property?" Margaret nodded and went back inside to retrieve another folder. The survey had been conducted just before she purchased the ranch, and it clearly marked all the boundary lines with precise measurements and GPS coordinates. Deputy Rodriguez spread the survey map on the hood of her patrol car and compared it to the GPS readings Deputy Chen had taken. She traced the property lines with her finger, checking and double-checking the measurements. Finally, she looked up at Derek with a serious expression. "Mr. Thompson, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about the property boundaries," she said carefully. "According to the official survey and our GPS readings, the actual property line is not where you think it is." Derek stared at her blankly. "What do you mean? The fence clearly marks the boundary." Deputy Rodriguez shook her head. "The fence was built in the wrong location. According to the legal property descriptions, Ms. Williams's property extends approximately 30 feet beyond where this fence is currently located." The color drained from Derek's face. "That's impossible," he whispered. Brad Morrison had been conducting his own investigation on his tablet, cross-referencing the survey data with county records. He looked up with an expression of growing concern. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to need to see the subdivision plat and the original survey for Prairie Vista Estates," he said grimly. "There appears to be a significant discrepancy in the property boundaries." Derek fumbled for his phone, calling someone frantically. Margaret could hear him demanding that someone bring the subdivision's legal documents immediately. His confident demeanor was rapidly crumbling as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Within 20 minutes, a car arrived carrying Derek's wife Sarah and a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as the subdivision's attorney. They brought boxes of documents including the original surveys, construction permits, and legal filings for Prairie Vista Estates. The attorney, Jonathan Hayes, spread the documents across the hood of another car and began comparing them to Margaret's survey. His face grew paler with each measurement he checked. Finally, he stood up straight and adjusted his tie nervously. "There's been a serious error," he announced quietly. "The fence was built based on an incorrect survey. The actual property boundary is indeed 30 feet into what we believed was subdivision property." Derek stared at him in shocked silence. Sarah Thompson grabbed her husband's arm, her voice rising with panic. "What does this mean? What about our house? What about all the houses?" Deputy Rodriguez was examining the subdivision plat more carefully, now measuring distances from the fence line to the nearest houses in Prairie Vista Estates. Her findings would change everything. The silence that followed Attorney Jonathan Hayes' announcement was deafening. Derek Thompson stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as the full implications of what he had just heard began to sink in. His wife Sarah clutched his arm tighter, her knuckles white with tension. Deputy Rodriguez continued her measurements, walking along what everyone had believed was the property boundary. Every few steps, she stopped to take GPS readings and compare them to the official survey documents. The more she measured, the more serious her expression became. "Ma'am," she said to Margaret, "according to these legal documents, approximately 1/3 of the Prairie Vista Estate subdivision has been built on your property without your knowledge or consent." Margaret felt the world spinning around her. She sat down heavily on her porch steps, trying to process what she was hearing. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "How is that possible?" Jonathan Hayes, the subdivision's attorney, was frantically making phone calls while rifling through legal documents. His conversation with the development company was heated and filled with legal jargon that Margaret couldn't follow. When he finally hung up, his face was ashen. "The original surveying company made a critical error," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "They misidentified a property marker and used it as a reference point for the entire subdivision layout. Every measurement after that was wrong by exactly 30 feet. Brad Morrison from Code Enforcement was taking extensive notes and photographs. "This is the largest surveying error I've encountered in 20 years of county work," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Derek finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled croak. "What does this mean for our homes? We paid $600,000 for our house." Deputy Chen had been quietly conducting his own investigation, examining the property stakes and survey markers that had been used during the original development. He called Deputy Rodriguez over to look at something near the fence line. "Maria, come look at this," he said, pointing to a partially buried concrete marker. "This appears to be an original property boundary marker, but it's been moved." "Deputy." Rodriguez knelt down to examine the marker more closely. The concrete was old and weathered, but she could see tool marks where it had been disturbed and reset. "This marker has definitely been relocated," she confirmed. "And based on the survey, it's not in the correct position." Margaret watched in amazement as more and more evidence emerged of the massive surveying error that had led to this situation. She felt a mixture of vindication and sympathy for her neighbors, who were clearly innocent victims of someone else's mistake. Sarah Thompson burst into tears. "We saved for 15 years to buy that house," she sobbed. "It's our dream home. Where are we supposed to live?" More residents from Prairie Vista Estates began arriving as word spread through the subdivision. Margaret counted at least 20 people gathered on what they had believed was her property, all talking at once and demanding answers from Derek and the attorney. Among the arriving residents was Robert Chen, a retired surveyor who had moved to Prairie Vista Estates specifically for its peaceful ranch setting. When he heard about the boundary dispute, he brought his own professional surveying equipment to verify the measurements. "I don't understand how this could happen," Robert said, setting up his transit device. "Professional surveyors have multiple safeguards to prevent errors this significant." Jonathan Hayes made another phone call, this time to the insurance company that had provided title insurance for the subdivision development. The conversation was lengthy and heated, with the attorney frequently repeating phrases like catastrophic, error, and massive liability. While the adults argued and measured, Margaret noticed that several children from the subdivision had wandered over to look at her horses. The kids were fascinated by the animals, asking innocent questions about their names and ages. The contrast between their wonder and their parents' panic struck her deeply. "Don't worry, kids," Margaret said gently. "The horses are very friendly. Would you like to feed them some carrots?" The children nodded eagerly, and Margaret retrieved some carrots from her kitchen. Watching the kids laugh and interact with Duchess and the other horses reminded her why she had fallen in love with ranch life in the first place. Robert Chen finished his survey measurements and announced his findings to the crowd. "The official survey is correct," he confirmed grimly. "The subdivision boundary is 30 feet into Ms. Williams' legal property. This affects at least 47 homes, plus the community center and the main entrance road." The crowd erupted in panicked conversations. Some residents demanded to know who was responsible. Others wanted to know if their home insurance would cover this situation. A few were already talking about lawsuits against the development company. Deputy Rodriguez called for quiet and addressed the crowd in her authoritative officer voice. Everyone needs to understand that this is a civil matter involving property boundaries and surveying errors. No criminal laws have been broken here. Derek Thompson stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and anger. But she called the police on us. She's trying to steal our land. Actually, Mr. Thompson, Deputy Rodriguez corrected him firmly. You called us. You requested that we investigate Ms. Williams for illegal farming activities on her own property. She has committed no crimes. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present. Derek had called the police to complain about Margaret's activities on what he believed was improperly zoned land. Instead, the investigation had revealed that a significant portion of his subdivision had been built on Margaret's legally owned property without her knowledge or consent. Jonathan Hayes finished a lengthy phone conversation and approached the BIME group with more devastating news. I've just spoken with the development company's executives, he announced. They are claiming that the surveying error was not their responsibility and that they relied on the professional survey they commissioned. So, who is responsible? Sarah Thompson demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. The surveying company that conducted the original boundary survey has been out of business for 3 years, Hayes replied quietly. The principals declared bankruptcy after several other major errors came to light. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the legal situation unfolding around her. All she had wanted was to live peacefully on her ranch with her animals. Now she found herself at the center of a massive property dispute that could affect dozens of families. Robert Chen approached Margaret respectfully. Ma'am, I want you to know that most of us had no idea about this boundary error. We're just families who bought homes in good faith. We're not your enemies. Margaret nodded, appreciating his honesty. I understand that, and I'm sorry you're all going through this. I never intended for any of this to happen. As the sun began to set, the crowd slowly dispersed, with residents returning to their homes to process the day's revelations and consider their options. Derek and Sarah Thompson were among the last to leave, walking slowly back toward their house with the weight of uncertainty heavy on their shoulders. Over the following weeks, Margaret's quiet ranch became the center of intense legal and media attention. The story of the massive surveying error had spread throughout the county and beyond, attracting news crews, lawyers, and curious onlookers who wanted to see the property dispute that had left an entire subdivision in legal limbo. Margaret found herself in an impossible position. Legally, she owned the land that nearly half of Prairie Vista Estates was built on, but morally, she felt terrible about the situation facing her neighbors. These families had invested their life savings in homes they believed they legally owned, and now they faced the possibility of losing everything through no fault of their own. The legal complexities multiplied daily. Jonathan Hayes, representing the HOA, filed emergency injunctions to prevent Margaret from taking any action that might displace the residents. Meanwhile, Margaret's own attorney, Rebecca Martinez, Joe Martinez's daughter, who had recently returned from law school in Austin, advised her that she had strong legal grounds to demand the removal of all structures built on her property. Margaret, you need to understand the full scope of your rights here, Rebecca explained during one of their meetings on the ranch. Under Texas property law, you could legally demand that all the buildings on your land be removed at the subdivision's expense. Margaret shook her head firmly. I don't want to hurt innocent families. There has to be another solution. The subdivision residents were dealing with their own nightmare. Most discovered that their homeowners' insurance policies didn't cover surveying errors or boundary disputes. The title insurance companies were arguing about liability and coverage, leaving the homeowners in legal limbo. Property values in Prairie Vista Estates plummeted as word of the dispute spread, making it impossible for residents to sell their homes and move elsewhere. Derek Thompson, once the confident HOA president, was now a broken man. His house was among those built entirely on Margaret's property, meaning he potentially had no legal claim to any of the land his home sat on. He had taken a leave of absence from his law firm to focus on the crisis, spending 18 hours a day researching property law and trying to find a solution. The media attention was overwhelming for everyone involved. Margaret found reporters camping outside her gate, trying to get interviews about the British woman who could evict an entire subdivision. The stories ranged from sympathetic portrayals of the displaced families to sensationalized accounts that painted Margaret as either a victim or a potential villain, depending on the publication's angle. Local television news ran daily updates on Ranchgate, as they had dubbed the controversy. Margaret was approached by several lawyers who offered to represent her pro bono in exchange for media attention. She declined them all, preferring to work with Rebecca Martinez, who understood both the legal issues and Margaret's desire to find a fair solution for everyone. The county government found itself in an unprecedented situation. County Commissioner Patricia Williams, no relation to Margaret, called emergency meetings to discuss how to handle the crisis. The county's legal liability was also unclear, since they had approved all the permits and inspections for Prairie Vista estates based on the flawed survey. "In 30 years of public service, I've never seen anything like this," Commissioner Williams told reporters. "We have families who bought homes in good faith, and we have a property owner whose land was developed without her knowledge. Everyone involved is a victim of professional negligence." 3 weeks after the initial police visit, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Dr. James Pemberton was a retired real estate professor from the University of Texas who specialized in complex property disputes. He had driven out to the ranch specifically to propose a solution. "Ms. Williams," Dr. Pemberton said as they sat on her porch watching the horses graze, "I believe there's a way to resolve this situation that could benefit everyone involved, but it requires thinking creatively about property law." Margaret poured him another cup of coffee and listened intently as he explained his proposal. Dr. Pemberton suggested creating a unique legal arrangement called a corrective subdivision that would allow the existing homes to remain while providing Margaret with fair compensation for her land. "The idea would be to officially resurvey and replat the entire area," he explained. "Margaret would retain ownership of the portion of her ranch that's not developed, plus receive significant compensation for the land where houses are built. The homeowners would receive clear title to their properties, and everyone avoids the catastrophic cost of relocating an entire subdivision." The proposal was intriguing, but it required cooperation from multiple parties, including the bankrupt surveying company's insurance carrier, the development company, the county government, and all the affected homeowners. Most importantly, it required Margaret's agreement to sell the disputed portion of her land rather than demanding the removal of all structures. Margaret spent several days considering the proposal. She walked her property lines daily, trying to envision what the ranch would look like if 30 feet were permanently carved off and sold to the subdivision. The land in question included some of her best pasture area and part of her favorite riding trail. During this time, she received visits from several subdivision residents who wanted to apologize for Derek's aggressive behavior and thank her for not immediately demanding that their homes be demolished. These conversations were emotional and difficult, but they helped Margaret understand the human impact of the situation. Robert Chen, the retired surveyor, became an unofficial liaison between Margaret and the subdivision residents. He organized a meeting at the community center where Margaret could hear directly from the affected families about their situations and concerns. The meeting was packed with over 100 residents, many of them elderly couples who had invested their retirement savings in Prairie Vista Estates homes. Margaret listened as family after family explained their situations: recent retirees, young couples with small children, single parents who had stretched financially to afford their homes. "Ms. Williams," said elderly resident Helen Foster, "I don't want you to think we're all like Derek Thompson. Most of us had no idea there was any problem with the property boundaries. We're just asking for a chance to find a solution that doesn't destroy our families." Margaret was deeply moved by the meeting. These were good people who had been caught in an impossible situation through no fault of their own. She realized that insisting on her strict legal rights would cause tremendous harm to innocent families, while working toward a compromise might allow everyone to move forward. After the community meeting, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone. including her own attorney. She announced that she was willing to consider selling the disputed land to the subdivision, but with specific conditions that would protect both her interests and the community's long-term stability. The announcement sparked a new round of intense negotiations involving lawyers, government officials, insurance companies, and community representatives. The legal and financial arrangements would be complex, but for the first time since the crisis began, there was hope that a solution might be possible. Derek Thompson, who had been largely absent from the community discussions, finally approached Margaret directly. The conversation would prove to be a turning point in the entire dispute. Derek Thompson approached Margaret's front gate on a gray Thursday morning, his usual confident swagger replaced by a hesitant, almost defeated posture. Margaret saw him through her kitchen window and felt a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. This was the man who had caused her so much trouble, yet she could see that the events of the past month had changed him dramatically. "Ms. Williams," Derek called out respectfully, "could I speak with you for a few minutes? I know I don't deserve your time, but I have something important to say." Margaret walked out to meet him at the gate, noticing that his expensive suit had been replaced by simple jeans and a casual shirt. His hair was no longer perfectly styled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of many sleepless nights. "I owe you an enormous apology," Derek began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong about everything, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you. I called the police on you when you were doing nothing but living peacefully on your own land." Margaret studied his face, seeing genuine remorse where there had once been arrogance and hostility. "I appreciate that, Derek. I know this situation has been hard on everyone." Derek nodded, struggling to find the right words. "I need to tell you the truth about why I was so aggressive toward you. It wasn't really about noise or smells or property values. I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that I had made a terrible mistake moving my family here," Derek admitted. "I grew up poor in the city, Ms. Williams. Really poor. I worked 3 jobs to get through law school, and when I finally made partner at my firm, I wanted to give my family everything I never had. This house was supposed to be our dream home, our symbol that we had finally made it." Margaret felt her anger toward Derek softening as she listened to his story. She recognized the vulnerability in his voice, the fear of a man who had risked everything for his family's future. "When you moved in with your ranch," Derek continued, "it represented everything I was trying to get away from. The unpredictability, the mess, the lack of control. I thought if I could just make you conform to subdivision standards, I could maintain the perfect life I thought I was building." "And now?" Margaret asked gently. Derek laughed bitterly. "Now I realize that my perfect life was built on someone else's land, literally and figuratively. I was so focused on controlling everything around me that I never bothered to verify that our own foundation was solid." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Thompson, who had apparently come looking for her husband. She approached the gate cautiously, clearly unsure of how Margaret would react to her presence. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson," Margaret said warmly. "Would you both like to come in for coffee? I think it's time we had a proper conversation." Sarah looked surprised by the invitation, but she and Derek both accepted. As they sat around Margaret's kitchen table, the 3 of them talked openly for the first time about the impact the property dispute had on all their lives. "I've been having nightmares about losing our home," Sarah admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. "Our children don't understand why we're so upset all the time, and we don't know how to explain that we might have to move again." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "I want you to know that I have no intention of forcing anyone from their homes. We're going to find a solution that works for everyone." Derek looked up with surprise and hope. "Do you really mean that? Even after how terrible I was to you?" "Derek, I've learned something important over the past few weeks," Margaret replied thoughtfully. "Holding on to anger and demanding strict justice doesn't make anyone's life better. What matters is finding a way forward that lets all of us live in peace." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Rebecca Martinez, Margaret's attorney, had arrived for their scheduled meeting about the latest developments in the legal negotiations. She was surprised to find the Thompsons, at Margaret's kitchen table, but she quickly recognized the significance of the moment. "Actually, this is perfect timing," Rebecca said, pulling up another chair. "I have news about the insurance settlement that affects everyone." Over the past week, Rebecca had been negotiating with multiple insurance companies, government agencies, and legal representatives. The bankrupt surveying company's professional liability insurance had finally agreed to pay a substantial settlement, acknowledging their responsibility for the massive error that had created the crisis. The insurance payout is significant enough to compensate Margaret fairly for the disputed land and fund the legal processes needed to give clear title to all the affected homeowners, Rebecca explained. But it requires everyone to agree to the corrective subdivision plan. Derek straightened up with interest. This was the first concrete hope he had heard since the crisis began. What exactly would that mean for the homeowners? Rebecca spread out legal documents and survey maps on Margaret's kitchen table. Essentially, the disputed area would be officially replatted as part of Prairie Vista Estates. Margaret would receive fair market value for the land, plus a premium for the inconvenience and disruption. The homeowners would get clear, uncontested title to their properties. Sarah Thompson looked confused by the legal terminology. "But what does that mean for us practically? Can we stay in our house?" "Yes," Rebecca confirmed. "You would own your land free and clear, with no boundary disputes or legal clouds on your title. The whole subdivision would be legally clean." Margaret had been listening carefully to the legal explanation, but she had additional concerns beyond the pure legal and financial aspects. "Rebecca, I want to make sure this arrangement includes some protections for the ranch operations that will continue on my remaining land." "What kind of protections?" Derek asked, genuinely curious now rather than hostile. Margaret explained her concerns about maintaining her agricultural operations without interference from the HOA. She wanted legal guarantees that she could continue raising horses and cattle, that normal ranch activities wouldn't be subject to noise complaints or zoning challenges, and that her property rights would be respected going forward. "I think those protections are absolutely reasonable," Derek said, surprising everyone at the table. "In fact, I think we should go further and establish formal agreements about cooperation between the ranch and the subdivision." Sarah looked at her husband with amazement. This was a completely different man from the one who had been obsessed with controlling every aspect of their neighborhood just a month earlier. Over the next 2 hours, the four of them worked out the basic framework for a comprehensive agreement that would resolve the property dispute while establishing a foundation for long-term cooperation between Margaret's Ranch and Prairie Vista Estates. The agreement included several innovative provisions. Margaret would sell the disputed land to the subdivision at fair market value, funded by the insurance settlement. In return, the HOA would formally acknowledge Margaret's right to operate her ranch without interference and would establish a good neighbor policy that respected agricultural operations. Most importantly, they agreed to create a joint committee with representatives from both the ranch and the subdivision to address any future concerns through direct communication rather than legal threats. Derek volunteered to personally apologize to every affected homeowner for his role in escalating the conflict unnecessarily. He also offered to resign as HOA president and help establish new leadership that would focus on cooperation rather than control. "I think Robert Chen would make an excellent HOA president," Derek suggested. "He's been a voice of reason throughout this whole crisis, and he understands both the technical and human aspects of what we've been dealing with." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Robert has been wonderful. He's helped so many families understand the legal situation and has always encouraged people to work with you rather than against you." Margaret felt a sense of relief washing over her as she realized that the hostility and conflict of the past month were finally giving way to genuine cooperation and understanding. The legal resolution would take several more weeks to finalize, but the human resolution was happening right at her kitchen table. As the afternoon wore on, more subdivision residents began stopping by Margaret's ranch. Word had spread that Derek and Sarah Thompson were meeting with Margaret, and people were curious about what was being discussed. Rather than turn them away, Margaret invited everyone to join the conversation. Soon, Margaret's front porch was filled with neighbors discussing the details of the proposed settlement and sharing their hopes for the future relationship between the ranch and the subdivision. Children played in Margaret's yard while their parents talked, and several residents asked if they could help with evening chores around the ranch. The spontaneous gathering became a turning point for the entire community. People who had barely spoken to each other before the crisis found themselves working together to find solutions. Margaret watched with amazement as her property became a gathering place for neighbors who had previously seen her as an outsider. As the sun began to set, Derek Thompson stood up to address the group that had gathered. His voice was strong and clear, but filled with emotion. "I owe all of you an apology," he began. "I let my fears and prejudices turn a simple misunderstanding into a crisis that could have destroyed our community. Margaret Williams is not our enemy. She's our neighbor, and she's shown us more grace and kindness than we had any right to expect." The crowd was silent as Derek continued. "I'm formally resigning as HOA president, effective immediately. I nominate Robert Chen to serve the remainder of my term, and I hope you'll all support leadership that focuses on building bridges rather than walls." Robert Chen looked surprised by the nomination, but accepted the responsibility with dignity. "If the community trusts me with this role, I promise to work toward solutions that benefit everyone, both ranch and subdivision residents." Margaret stood up to address the group as well. "I want everyone to know that I consider myself fortunate to be part of this community. What happened here over the past few weeks wasn't really about property lines or zoning laws. It was about fear and misunderstanding, and we've proven that those can be overcome with honest communication and good faith." The gathering ended with practical discussions about next steps. Rebecca Martinez explained the legal timeline for finalizing the settlement. Robert Chen organized committees to handle communication with insurance companies and government agencies. Several residents volunteered to help Margaret with ranch work as a way of building relationships and learning about agricultural life. Most importantly, they established regular community meetings that would alternate between the subdivision's community center and Margaret's ranch, ensuring that both sides of their shared boundary would remain connected and engaged. As people began to leave, Derek Thompson approached Margaret one final time. "Ms. Williams, I know I can never fully make up for the trouble I caused you, but I want you to know that you've taught me something important about what it means to be a good neighbor." Margaret smiled and shook his hand warmly. "Derek, we all learned something important. Sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places." The crisis that had begun with a hostile phone call to police was ending with handshakes, shared meals, and plans for cooperation. The legal paperwork would take time to complete, but the real resolution had already happened in Margaret's kitchen and on her front porch, where neighbors had chosen understanding over anger and community over conflict. 6 months later, Margaret Williams stood on her front porch watching the sunrise paint the Texas sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The view was different now than it had been a year ago, but in many ways, it was better. The legal nightmare that had consumed everyone's lives for weeks had been resolved completely, and what had emerged from the crisis was something none of them had expected: a genuine community. The corrective subdivision plan had been approved by all parties and finalized by the county in record time. Margaret had received fair compensation for the 30 feet of her property where Prairie Vista Estates homes had been built, funded by the substantial insurance settlement from the bankrupt surveying company. Every homeowner in the affected area now held clear, uncontested title to their property. More importantly, the crisis had transformed relationships throughout the area in ways that surprised everyone involved. What had started as a hostile dispute between a ranch owner and suburban homeowners had evolved into a model of rural-suburban cooperation that was being studied by community planners across Texas. Margaret's horses still grazed in the early morning light, but now they had regular visitors. Several children from the subdivision had become expert helpers with feeding and grooming, and their parents had discovered that ranch work provided a peaceful escape from their high-stress jobs in the city. The joint committee that Margaret and Derek had proposed during their kitchen table negotiations had become the foundation for numerous collaborative projects. The subdivision residents had volunteered to help Margaret expand her barn in exchange for riding lessons for their children. Margaret had shared her expertise in sustainable agriculture, to help the HOA create community gardens that reduced water usage and provided fresh vegetables for residents. Robert Chen had proven to be an excellent HOA president, approaching every issue with the measured professionalism of his surveying background and the diplomatic skills he had developed during the boundary crisis. Under his leadership, the HOA had revised all their policies to focus on cooperation and community building, rather than rigid rule enforcement. The monthly community meetings alternating between the ranch and the subdivision community center had become popular social events that regularly drew over 100 participants. Margaret had learned to make her famous British scones for these gatherings, while subdivision residents contributed potluck dishes and organized activities for the children. Derek Thompson had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of anyone involved in the original conflict. After resigning as HOA president, he had taken a sabbatical from his law firm to reassess his priorities and spend more time with his family. During this period, he had become one of Margaret's most dedicated volunteers, helping with everything from fence repair to horse training. "Margaret taught me that trying to control everything around you is a recipe for misery," Derek told a reporter who was writing a follow-up story about the community. "Real security comes from building relationships with your neighbors, not from enforcing rules on them." Derek had eventually returned to his law practice, but with a new specialization in collaborative dispute resolution. He was using his experience with the boundary crisis to help other communities resolve conflicts through mediation, rather than litigation. Sarah Thompson had discovered a talent for organizing community events and had become the unofficial social coordinator for the combined ranch subdivision community. She had organized seasonal festivals, holiday celebrations, and educational programs that brought together people from both sides of the former boundary dispute. The children had been the biggest winners in the resolution. Kids from Prairie Vista estates now spent their afternoons learning to care for horses, goats, and chickens. They had organized a 4-H club that combined traditional suburban activities with agricultural education. Margaret had become a beloved mentor figure, teaching them not only about animal care but about responsibility, patience, and the satisfaction of physical work. The media attention had eventually faded, but not before the story had inspired similar collaboration efforts in other communities facing rural-suburban tensions. Margaret received letters from ranch owners and homeowners associations across the country, asking for advice on resolving their own boundary disputes and zoning conflicts. Local government officials had also learned valuable lessons from the crisis. County Commissioner Patricia Williams had initiated a comprehensive review of surveying and permitting procedures to prevent similar errors in the future. The county had also established a mediation program specifically designed to help resolve property disputes before they escalated to legal action. The economic impact of the resolution had been positive for everyone involved. Property values in Prairie Vista estates had not only recovered, but had actually increased above pre-crisis levels as buyers were attracted to the unique rural-suburban community that had emerged from the dispute. Margaret's ranch had become more profitable as well, with boarding fees from subdivision residents who wanted to keep horses and educational programs that attracted visitors from surrounding areas. On this particular morning, Margaret was expecting special visitors. A delegation from a community in Colorado was coming to learn about their collaborative approach to rural-suburban relations. The group included ranchers, homeowners association representatives, and local government officials who were dealing with their own boundary and zoning conflicts. As Margaret prepared for their arrival, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when Derek Thompson had called the police on her. What had seemed like a disaster at the time had ultimately led to the rich, connected community life she had always dreamed of, but never experienced during her years in England. The sound of vehicles approaching brought Margaret back to the present. The first car contained the Colorado delegation, but following behind them were several trucks carrying Prairie Vista Estates residents who had volunteered to help with the demonstration and discussion. Robert Chen emerged from one vehicle with a cooler full of drinks, while Sarah Thompson coordinated the setup of tables and chairs under the large oak tree beside Margaret's barn. Derek Thompson arrived with his children, who immediately ran off to help with the morning horse feeding. Watching them work confidently with the animals, Margaret marveled at how much they had all grown and learned over the past months. "Are you ready to tell our story again?" Derek asked Margaret, approaching with a smile that was genuine and relaxed in a way that would have been impossible during the height of their conflict. Margaret nodded, looking around at the bustling activity as her neighbors prepared for the educational presentation. "I think we have a good story to tell," she replied. "Not because we avoided conflict, but because we learned how to resolve it in a way that made everyone stronger." As the Colorado delegation gathered around the demonstration area, Margaret began the presentation the same way she always did, with a simple truth that had emerged from their complicated experience. "The most important thing we learned," she told the visitors, "is that good neighbors aren't people who never disagree with each other. Good neighbors are people who care enough about their community to work through their disagreements and find solutions that make life better for everyone." The morning sun climbed higher in the Texas sky as Margaret and her neighbors shared their story with another group of people facing similar challenges. The ranch that had once been a source of conflict had become a symbol of hope and cooperation, proving that even the most difficult disputes could be transformed into opportunities for building stronger, more connected communities.